Behind closed doors, a deep dive into spouse privilege and its legal impact. Marriage is often considered a sacred bond, not just in a cultural or emotional sense, but also within the legal framework. One fascinating aspect of this legal bond is what's known as spouse privilege or spousal privilege. This concept protects certain communications and interactions between married couples from being disclosed in court. To fully appreciate spouse privilege, we need to explore its types, applications, and implications within the legal system. Types of spouse privilege. There are two main types of spouse privilege: testimonial and communication. 1. Testimonial privilege. Testimonial privilege prevents one spouse from being forced to testify against another in a court of law. This privilege is rooted in the idea that compelling a spouse to testify against their partner could create discord and undermine the marital relationship. Testimonial privilege can vary by jurisdiction, but it generally applies to criminal cases and, in some instances, civil cases. For example, in a criminal trial, if John is accused of a crime, his wife, Jane, cannot be compelled to take the stand and testify against him if she invokes testimonial privilege. This privilege typically lasts only as long as the marriage. If the marriage ends, so does the privilege. 2. Communication privilege. Communication privilege covers private communications between spouses. It ensures that any confidential communications shared during the marriage cannot be disclosed in court without the consent of the spouse who made the communication. This privilege applies even after the marriage has ended, safeguarding the confidentiality of marital communications indefinitely. Imagine Stormy confides in her husband, Tom, about a sensitive matter during their marriage. Even if Stormy and Tom later divorce, Tom cannot be forced to reveal Stormy's confidential communication in court if she asserts the communication privilege. Practical applications and limitations. While spouse privilege offers significant protections, it is not absolute. There are important limitations and exceptions to consider. 1. Crime fraud exception. If the communication or testimony involves the planning or commissioning of a crime or fraud, spouse privilege does not apply. For instance, if one spouse confides in the other about plans to commit a crime, the privilege is voided. 2. Abuse cases. In cases involving domestic violence or abuse, many jurisdictions do not allow spouse privilege to be used as a shield. The courts recognize the importance of protecting victims and ensuring justice is served over maintaining marital confidentiality in such instances. 3. Consent and waiver. A spouse can choose to waive their privilege. If both spouses consent to disclose the information, the privilege no longer applies. For example, if both parties agree that the communication is relevant and necessary for a legal proceeding, they can waive the privilege. Real-life anecdotes. Case of testimonial privilege. Consider the high-profile case of the United States versus Nixon in 1974. While not directly involving spouse privilege, it highlighted the importance of certain protected communications. In a similar vein, imagine a modern scenario where a spouse is called to testify about a conversation that occurred in the privacy of their home. The tension between upholding the sanctity of marriage and the pursuit of justice is palpable, and the court must navigate these waters carefully. Communication privilege in practice. A friend who works as a defense attorney once shared a story about a case involving a confidential marital conversation. The husband had confided in his wife about his involvement in a minor but embarrassing misdemeanor. When the case went to trial, the wife was called to testify. Invoking communication privilege, she protected their private conversation, and the court respected her decision. This example underscores the importance of trust and privacy within a marriage, even in legal contexts. Spouse privilege is a nuanced and essential aspect of the legal system that balances the protection of marital harmony with the pursuit of justice. Understanding its types, applications, and limitations helps us appreciate its role in safeguarding both personal relationships and the integrity of the legal process. While it may not be a topic that comes up in everyday conversation, spouse privilege plays a crucial role in the intersection of personal lives and the law, ensuring that the bonds of marriage are respected within the courtroom. By exploring the intricacies of spouse privilege through real-life anecdotes and practical examples, we can better understand its significance and the delicate balance it strikes between marital privacy and legal obligations. Variations in spouse privilege across jurisdictions. Spouse privilege, while rooted in a common principle of protecting marital communications and testimonial immunity, is interpreted and applied differently across various jurisdictions. These differences can be significant, reflecting local legal traditions, statutes, and judicial precedents. In the United States, both federal and state laws address spouse privilege, leading to considerable variation. Under federal law, spousal privileges are recognized but with specific guidelines. The federal courts generally acknowledge two types of spousal privilege. 1. Adverse spousal testimony privilege. This allows a spouse to refuse to testify against their partner in criminal cases. Notably, the privilege belongs to the testifying spouse, meaning they can choose whether or not to invoke it. This privilege ends upon the dissolution of the marriage. 2. Marital communications privilege. This protects confidential communications made during the marriage. Unlike the testimonial privilege, this one persists even after the marriage ends, ensuring that past private conversations remain protected indefinitely. Under state laws, each state has its interpretation and application of spousal privileges, often with unique nuances. For example, in California, both the adverse spousal testimony privilege and the marital communications privilege are recognized. The state's laws are particularly strict about the confidentiality of marital communications. New York also acknowledges both types of privileges but with specific conditions. For instance, New York's courts have held that the adverse spousal testimony privilege can only be claimed in criminal cases, not civil cases. In the UK, the concept of spousal privilege is more limited compared to the US. Testimonial privilege. In criminal cases, spouses can be compelled to testify against each other unless the testimony relates to confidential marital communications. However, there are exceptions, particularly in cases involving domestic violence or abuse. Marital communications privilege. The UK does recognize the confidentiality of marital communications, protecting them from disclosure in most legal proceedings. However, similar to other jurisdictions, this privilege can be overridden in cases of criminal activity or abuse. Canadian law also provides for spousal privilege but with distinct characteristics. Testimonial privilege. Canadian law generally prevents spouses from being compelled to testify against each other in criminal cases, maintaining a focus on protecting marital harmony. Marital communications privilege. This privilege is robust in Canada, ensuring that confidential communications between spouses remain protected. Canadian courts have consistently upheld the importance of this privilege in maintaining trust within the marital relationship. In Australia, the treatment of spousal privilege aligns closely with that of the UK, with some variations across states and territories. Testimonial privilege. Australian law typically exempts spouses from being forced to testify against each other in criminal cases, but this can vary. Some states have more stringent rules, particularly regarding cases of domestic violence. Marital communications privilege. Like in the UK and Canada, marital communications are generally protected. However, Australian courts have demonstrated a willingness to override this privilege in instances where public interest or justice demands it. The interpretation and application of spouse privilege vary significantly across jurisdictions, reflecting local legal traditions and priorities. In the United States, there is a notable distinction between federal and state applications, while in countries like the UK, Canada, and Australia, the principles are more uniformly applied but still subject to specific legal exceptions. Understanding these variations is crucial for legal professionals and individuals navigating the complexities of spousal privilege in different legal contexts. If you found value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, like and subscribe to support this channel. Please share across social media platforms to reach a wider audience. Ongoing discussions and debates on spouse privilege laws. Spouse privilege laws, while deeply rooted in legal traditions, are not immune to contemporary debates and discussions. As societal norms and legal priorities evolve, so too do the conversations around the relevance and application of these privileges. Here are some key areas of ongoing debate and potential changes being considered. Balancing privacy and justice. 1. Domestic violence and abuse. One of the most significant areas of debate concerns the application of spouse privilege in cases of domestic violence and abuse. Critics argue that allowing a spouse to invoke privilege in these cases can obstruct justice and protect abusers. Advocates for change are pushing for more exceptions to spousal privileges in situations involving domestic violence, child abuse, and other forms of familial harm. Case example: in some jurisdictions, there have been legislative efforts to amend laws to ensure that spouse privilege cannot be used to shield abusers from prosecution. For instance, some states in the U.S. have introduced bills that specifically exclude domestic violence cases from the protections of spousal testimonial privilege. 2. Crime-fraud exception. Another contentious issue is the crime-fraud exception to spouse privilege. While it is generally accepted that privilege should not protect communications or testimonies related to the commission of a crime or fraud, the precise boundaries of this exception are often debated. Legal scholars and policymakers are discussing whether the scope of this exception should be broadened to cover a wider range of criminal activities. There are ongoing debates about whether certain types of financial crimes or conspiracies should automatically nullify spousal privileges, reflecting an increased focus on transparency and accountability. Technological advances and privacy concerns. 1. Digital communications. The advent of digital communication has added complexity to the issue of spousal privilege. With couples increasingly communicating via text messages, emails, and social media, courts are grappling with how to apply traditional privilege concepts to these modern forms of communication. Legal experts are debating whether digital communications should be granted the same level of protection as traditional verbal or written communications. This includes discussions on encryption, data privacy, and the potential for digital surveillance. 2. Data retention and surveillance. With increasing government surveillance and data retention policies, there are concerns about the extent to which spousal communications can remain private. Some argue that spousal privilege needs to be updated to provide clearer protections in the context of modern surveillance technologies. In some countries, there have been proposals to enhance privacy laws to ensure that spousal communications are not easily accessible to government agencies without proper legal processes. Gender and equality considerations. 1. Gender neutrality. There are ongoing discussions about ensuring that spousal privilege laws are gender neutral and do not reinforce outdated gender roles. Advocates for gender equality are pushing for reforms that recognize the equal standing of both spouses in invoking or waiving privileges. Some jurisdictions are reviewing their laws to eliminate any language or interpretations that might imply a bias towards one gender, ensuring that both spouses have equal rights under the law. International perspectives and harmonization. 1. Globalization and cross-border issues. With increasing globalization, more cross-border marriages and legal issues arise from differing spousal privilege laws. Legal professionals and international bodies are discussing the need for more harmonized laws to provide consistent protection across borders. There are ongoing talks in international legal forums about establishing more uniform guidelines for spousal privilege that can be recognized and enforced across different jurisdictions, aiding in cross-border legal proceedings. The debates and discussions around spousal privilege laws reflect broader societal changes and evolving legal landscapes. As issues of domestic violence, digital privacy, gender equality, and international harmonization gain prominence, there is a clear push for reforms that can make spousal privilege laws more relevant and effective in today's world. While changes may be gradual, these ongoing conversations are crucial for ensuring that the legal system balances the protection of marital privacy with the demands of justice and societal well-being. Notable cases involving spouse privilege. Spouse privilege has been invoked in numerous legal cases, each with unique circumstances and implications. Here are some specific examples that highlight how spousal privilege has been applied and the broader legal and societal implications of these cases. 1. Trammel v. United States, 1980. In this landmark U.S. Supreme Court case, Otis Trammel was accused of drug trafficking. During the trial, the prosecution called his wife to testify against him. Trammel invoked spousal testimonial privilege to prevent her from testifying. The Supreme Court ruled that the testimonial privilege belongs to the witness spouse alone, meaning Mrs. Trammel could choose whether or not to testify against her husband. She chose to testify, providing critical evidence that contributed to his conviction. This case significantly narrowed the scope of spousal testimonial privilege in federal courts, emphasizing that the privilege to refuse to testify against a spouse lies with the witness spouse, not the defendant. It underscored a shift towards balancing marital harmony with the pursuit of justice. 2. United States v. Fisher, 1983. In this case, Fisher was charged with embezzlement and tax fraud. During the investigation, Fisher's wife had recorded conversations between them discussing the criminal activities. The defense sought to exclude these recordings under marital communications privilege. The court ruled that since Mrs. Fisher had voluntarily recorded the conversations and handed them over to the authorities, the privilege did not apply. The recordings were admitted as evidence, leading to Fisher's conviction. This case highlighted the limitations of marital communications privilege, particularly when one spouse voluntarily breaches confidentiality. It also underscored the potential for spousal cooperation with authorities in criminal investigations. 3. People v. Sanger, 2001. In California, John Sanger was accused of sexually abusing a minor. During the investigation, his wife disclosed conversations in which he had admitted to the abuse. Sanger attempted to invoke marital communications privilege to exclude these statements from evidence. The court held that the statements were admissible because they fell under the crime-fraud exception to marital communications privilege. Since the communications related to ongoing criminal activity, the privilege was voided. This case reinforced the crime-fraud exception to marital communications privilege, illustrating that communications related to criminal activities are not protected. It also highlighted the court's prioritization of protecting victims and ensuring justice over maintaining marital confidentiality. 4. State v. McGuire, 2004. In New Jersey, Melanie McGuire was accused of murdering her husband. The prosecution sought to introduce evidence that included her discussions with a new romantic partner about her husband's death. McGuire's defense argued that spousal privilege should exclude these discussions. The court ruled that spousal privilege did not apply because the communications in question were not with her spouse but with a third party. Furthermore, the privilege did not cover actions taken to conceal a crime. This case demonstrated the boundaries of spousal privilege, clarifying that it does not extend to communications with third parties or actions taken to cover criminal behavior. It also underscored the importance of evidence in securing convictions in serious criminal cases. 5. United States v. Windsor, 2013. Although not directly a case about spousal privilege, United States v. Windsor had significant implications for spousal privileges and same-sex marriages. Edith Windsor challenged the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, after being denied federal estate tax exemption for surviving spouses because her marriage to her wife was not recognized federally. The Supreme Court ruled that DOMA was unconstitutional, thus recognizing same-sex marriages at the federal level and ensuring that same-sex spouses were entitled to the same legal privileges as opposite-sex spouses, including spousal privileges in legal proceedings. This landmark ruling expanded the application of spousal privileges to same-sex marriages, ensuring that all married couples, regardless of gender, have equal protection under the law. It was a significant step towards equality and reinforced the legal recognition of same-sex relationships. These cases illustrate the complexity and evolving nature of spousal privilege in the legal system. From limiting the scope of testimonial privilege to reinforcing the crime-fraud exception, courts have navigated the delicate balance between protecting marital confidentiality and ensuring justice. Each case contributes to the nuanced understanding of spousal privilege and its role in modern jurisprudence. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up, like and subscribe to our channel for more self-improvement videos. Comment below to tell us how useful you found this video. Remember to share on various social media platforms to reach a wider audience. Click the notification bell to get notified anytime we post a new video. Thanks for watching, see you in the next video.